Dr. Gary Habermas is with us. He is a distinguished research professor at Liberty University, and for many years was the head of the philosophy department there. He currently lectures for the PhD program in theology and apologetics for the Rawlings School of Divinity, teaching seminars on apologetic method, evidentialism, early church creeds, and religious doubt. Dr. Habermas is a world-renowned expert on the historicity of the resurrection of Jesus and has 45 book publications that he's either authored, co-authored, or edited, over 70 chapters, essays, and articles in addition, and additional books, has over 100 published articles and reviews, and has done around 2,000 lectures at about 100 universities, colleges, seminaries, and churches, both in the US and abroad. He is currently working on his magnum opus, which is a multi-volume series on his life's work and research on the historicity of the resurrection of Jesus. His first volume, we just was talking about this before everyone came on, his first volume was just published or sent to the publishers. It focuses on the historical evidences surrounding the resurrection of Jesus, and it was only about 1,200 pages in length. And he's planning on having 4 volumes. So will be a tremendous resource when all is said and done. To make a connection for you all with Dr. Habermas through the ministry, ICM has worked with Lee Strobel at some of our ministry events. In Strobel's very popular book, The Case for Christ, one of the scholars that Lee Strobel interviews was Dr. Habermas. And so in that last section of the book, Dr. Habermas and some other very well-known Christian apologists are in that last and final section where they discuss about evidences surrounding the resurrection. There's one more thing that I would want to add on a personal note. So alongside all these accolades and academic achievement, there's one thing about Dr. Habermas that I admire, and that he cares deeply about doing the work of the ministry. He doesn't sit back in the ivory tower of academia. He wants to engage people on the resurrection and make his research available to all. So just a note of thanks to you, Dr. Habermas, for taking time out of your schedule. I know you're speaking a lot at different engagements and writing a lot. I just want to thank you for joining us today and sharing with us as we head into our time to talk about the resurrection. So I want to go ahead and dive just right into the first question. Dr. Habermas, you are a philosopher and a historian, and you study the resurrection of Jesus from a historical perspective, where you examine the historical evidence surrounding the resurrection event. You have developed what is known as the minimal facts argument or approach to the resurrection. Could you briefly explain that approach and then share with us the 4 to 5 facts you use the most in your lectures and presentations and why you choose them as you do?
Thank you, Kevin. The minimal facts argument that Kevin mentioned came from my PhD work at a state university. And as the committee approved my topic, we were walking out and the head of the program said to me, he said, "We don't mind if you do the resurrection." He said, we're liberal here, but he said, we're good liberal. What we mean by that is we don't have to agree with you to grant your PhD. We just want it to be well defended. And he started to walk away, and then he turned back and he said, "Oh, by the way, don't tell us it happened because the Bible said so." And he walked away. Well, my topic was already approved. And my first thought was, I'm going to have to explain, I'm going to have to find out what he meant by that to see what grounds I can go on. And here's what critical scholars mean. They do not mean, when they say that, they do not mean don't use the New Testament. They don't mean don't cite the New Testament. They mean don't say something is true because merely citing a verse makes it true. You have to give some reasons and basically use those verses which have backup. Now, we'll be talking, I assume, a little bit about the backup, but that was his response. Only use New Testament verses that have backup. And to give you an example of backup, there are 13 books in the New Testament that bear Paul's name as the author. And of those 13 books, critics, no matter how liberal they are, as long as they're scholars, they're not just people who go off on Christianity, they're trained in the relevant fields of New Testament theology, history, classics, archaeology. They're trained in a relevant field with hopefully a terminal degree. And of those 13 books that have Paul's name, they'll let you use 7 of them. Now, I don't know if you think that's good news not to get all 13. I mean, bad news not to get all 13, or good news that they're going to let you use 7. Because the 7 they let you use are the major books by Paul, namely Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, the first 4 there of the Pauline books, and then Philippians, 1st Thessalonians, and Philemon. Those 7. And if you cite verses there, you're fine. Now, that doesn't mean they agree with you, but that means you're fine critically. So I had to learn all this. And what I did was I developed a method where I would use and the number of facts I use go back and forth. It depends on who my audience is. There's not just this number, but I use 6. And the 6 I use right now anyway are that Jesus died by crucifixion. Second one, his disciples had experiences that they believed were appearances of the risen Jesus. Thirdly, this event was proclaimed very, very, very early. And I suppose we'll be talking about that because the information on when they first started telling the story is just incredible, and it's accepted by everybody. Fourth, their lives were absolutely transformed to the point of being willing to die. We do not know how many disciples were martyrs, because some of our material is kind of late on the 12, a little spotty in history. But we can say that those who went out preaching the gospel were willing to die for the message. And somebody might say, well, how do you know they're willing to die? You can't read their minds, can you? And I usually say, well, no, but I can read their feet. And when they keep going into cities where they've already been beat up and thrown out, or where they're in danger of that because it's right next door to a city where it happened, and they keep doing it, that means they're willing to take the punishment in order to preach the message. And then lastly, 2 skeptics, 2 previous unbelievers, James, the brother of Jesus, and Saul of Tarsus, better known as Paul, both became believers because they had experiences that they thought were appearances of the risen Jesus. So they're the 6 I use. These facts are granted, and you can use them, and you push them as far as you can go. Of course, they're not inclined to believe in supernatural events like resurrections, but that's the facts, Kevin.
Great. Yeah. So let's take that a little further. So how do you, so you just mentioned that the skeptics will give you those minimal facts, they'll grant them to you, but yet they themselves will say, well, we still don't believe Jesus, rose from the dead. You have good facts, but we won't grant you that. How do you then take those historical facts and say, no, the best explanation that we have for this is that Jesus actually rose from the dead? Because there's 2 separate steps there. There's the facts and then the explanation that accounts for them. So walk us through that part of the process.
Yeah, you're exactly right. There's 2 separate facts. One is, I don't mean 2 separate facts like the kind I just mentioned. I mean like 1, 2, 3, 4. But there's 2 separate moves here. One is the actual data conceded by the critical community of scholars. By the way, many of these people who concede these are atheist, agnostic, self-identified, non-Christian New Testament scholars, or one of those areas. In other words, they study the field and teach it as a discipline, but they're not believers. And so you've got the data, and as Kevin just mentioned, you've got the interpretation. And those are the two parts. What happened and what are the interpretations? And they'll basically, whether they say so or not, be dialoguing about the interpretations because they allow the facts. So there's that angle. And the other thing is an aspect of their interpretation is their worldview. And as most scholars know who get into this material, most of our worldviews are more important to us than the facts. They can allow the facts, but their take on them, if you take a view that there's no such thing as miracles, it's going to take you a while to have the influence of these data points reach into you. And it almost has to reach the point where either the Holy Spirit is really, really moving and you're kind of, overcome by that, or you're convinced by the data. But at the very least, the data can hang out there without an explanation. And they may say they don't believe, but the facts are still out there. And so they're very powerful. I've got a good friend, Greg Kokel, who's another apologist who's out and lecturing. And he has, when someone accuses him, if he's at a university or something, and he's accused of trying to convert the crowd or something like that, he's got this little saying that shows you how influential these facts are. He says, I'm not trying to convert you. I mean, he'd like to, but he'll say, I'm not trying to convert you. I'm trying to put a stone in your shoe. And you know what stones in shoes do? They're aggravating till you stop and take your shoe off and drop the stone out and put the shoe back on. You've got to deal with the stone in your shoe. I mean, very few things bother as much as that. And that's what these facts do. If they're alive and well, and you can say, yeah, I don't believe that. But there's a lot of people out there and colleagues and so on who believe it. And you don't know what to do with it. You just say, yeah, I don't think so. It's a stone. And a lot of people who come to Christ, it's because they deal with the stone in their shoe until they finally get things right with the Lord. So it's not just, oh, you don't agree? Well, golly, I'm sorry I took your time. It's not that at all, because they're still setting out there as being established and as being bothersome, I think, to those who don't believe. And that could be, the Holy Spirit.
Very good. So in summary, there's these facts that virtually all these scholars, skeptical and conservative alike, agree upon. It's the interpretation of them that becomes this stumbling block. So if you could, I know there have been attempts by scholars to explain these facts apart from saying, well, Jesus actually rose from the dead. So what's one or two of the alternative theories that you encounter the most, or you find maybe most difficult to engage in, or something along those lines? What are the most current trends that you see in scholarship, as well as what you may experience when you're giving lectures elsewhere?
Well, for most of 200 years, going back to just prior to 1800, I don't know, it's, over 220 years, scholars who don't believe typically throw out some kind of theory that they think can explain the facts, and it's an alternative theory or a natural theory, something that can happen in the natural world. Like you could explain a magic trick by explaining the mechanism behind the trick. And if you could explain the mechanism behind the empty tomb, and especially the resurrection appearances, then you can rest assured that the stone is out of your shoe, and pretty much, and it might come back and nag you, but you think it's done. Well, here's what's happened to the naturalistic theories. I just made a proposal just yesterday to presenting a lecture on this to a group of scholars. And what I wanted to say in the little description of my lecture is that most critical scholars don't use these theories anymore. Here's a naturalistic theory. Jesus wasn't raised from the dead. What really happened was fill in the blank. And if you don't fill in the blank, in my estimation, you're not really coming up with a naturalistic theory. If you say, Jesus is not raised from the dead, I'm sorry, those things don't happen. That's not really a naturalistic theory. That's what we call a denial. And a denial, in terms of logic, a denial, no, I don't believe Jesus is raised from the dead, is no more valuable than a yes, I believe Jesus is raised from the dead. That's an affirmation and a denial. But if you want to make a natural theory and tell us what really happened, then tell us how to fill in that blank. And they've tried over the years, hallucination, Jesus never died. These things, by and large, are dead in the water. On the Jesus never died, I just co-authored an article with a colleague and a third person who's a medical person, finishing their MD, and plus they already have a PhD from medical school. And we got this published in a medical journal, the Baylor University journal. And we surveyed about 50 scholars on how you die in death by crucifixion, what probably happened to Jesus, and how we know it was dead. It was peer reviewed, and the article was accepted. So you're almost never going to find any scholars today who think Jesus didn't die. So we're on pretty good grounds today. So what happens is generally they don't take you on with naturalistic theories. If they do, if they guess one, chances are that means they're really not up on the data. Because even Bart Ehrman, who's an atheist New Testament scholar, very well-known one, he says, when I was an evangelical, I used to love people to pick those theories because the facts we had would immediately be mounted up against that. And it got to the point where people wouldn't pick theories anymore. So that's kind of what happens. But today, Kevin, I'd say there's very few scholars who will take one theory and go with it. Because if you pick one theory, I'm sure this is the theory, I'm going to fill in the blank with this. The problem is when the facts go up against you, and many, many of them, they come like an avalanche. It's pretty hard then to say, let me try another one. Well, then that makes you look really weak. Your theory makes your theory look weak. So I think we're in good stead on the rational reasons. And of course, we rely on the Holy Spirit. I don't think you can argue somebody into the kingdom. I think God has to get a hold of you. And we rely on either people coming to know that right away, or the stone on their shoes to work on.
Very good. So you mentioned just now, like in terms of like rational reasons that people might reject, you really highlighting that there aren't, like in terms of what theory best accounts for the fact, you're saying the resurrection by far best accounts for all of these. So what's the reason the disciples believed they saw the risen Jesus? Well, he rose from the dead. Why did Paul convert? Because he encountered the risen Jesus. So you seem to be implying, and I think you mentioned this earlier, that it really boils down to a worldview issue and whether or not someone believes either God exists or that miracles can happen. So for someone who engages that kind of dialogue, what would you say there? How do you help someone make that shift in the argument to say, you know what, you've got good facts, you've got good reasons, man, I just don't believe in a place like Narnia or Middle Earth or something like that. It's just too hard for me to believe in the supernatural realm. And what would you do at that point?
Yeah, and you raise a good point, Kevin. That is probably the most popular comeback today. I may not be able to fill in that blank, but I don't believe in that world. And all the data we have say that this world is all there is. And it's hard for me to mention, as you say, to use your examples, it's hard for me to imagine Aslan or Gandalf or these magical persons who exist in other realities other than a feel-good storybook reality. And so when they tell me that, there's different ways you can go about it. In different ways, those of us who talk about the resurrection go about that. The way I would do it, I would say, let's get a time out here. Let's switch subjects a little bit. And my favorite way of doing it is next to the resurrection, the topic that I've spent the most time studying over decades is the subject of near-death experiences. And I don't know if you folks are aware of this, but in some very technical books, there are over 300 near-death experiences that are highly evidenced. In fact, one book has reports of over, I believe it's over 36 people who report data when they, according to the machines, according to all we know, they have their brain and heart are not operating. Their brain and heart are not operating, and yet they can report something that happens 2 floors away in the hospital, sometimes a mile away in their home. And they report these things, and what they report happened while they were out. And take a near-death experience that's not even evidenced. It just the person says, I was being operated on, I was up above my body, and then I went back down on my body. And by the way, it's estimated that there are up to 20 million of those cases. I believe the figure was in North America and Europe alone, over 20 million. But here's the point, even if they're not evidenced, the person says, it's just their testimony, many times it's evidence, but they'll say, and here's the key, they'll say, they'll look down at the doctor like 10 feet below them, and they'll say, don't pound on my chest, stop pounding on me. Or to a husband or wife, or child who's nearby, they'll say, don't worry about me, I'm doing fine. Actually, I'd rather stay here. And nobody ever looks up at them and says, oh, cut it out and get back down here. People are not even aware they're there. So they're in an alternate reality. And you say, yeah, but that sounds like Aslan. Not if they give you evidence of what their family's doing in the waiting room 1 floor away. And they give specific phrases, specific phrases that are repeated. So all I'm saying is there are a lot of data for another reality. And you know what's odd is that near-death experiences concern the afterlife. The resurrection concerns the afterlife. So the resurrection happens in the same realm where people say they go after they die. So how can you then deny an afterlife? By the way, folks, this stunned me when I heard it. I was on the way to a big conference this last weekend, and the fellow I was driving with showed me a statistic from one of the best known atheists in the country. And the atheist said, figure this out. The atheist said, and he has a journal that catalogs these things. And he said, about 1/3 of the agnostics and atheists in this country believe in an afterlife. Figure that one out. 1/3 of the atheists and agnostics believe in an afterlife. All right, now you're in trouble, because if 1/3 of atheists will grant an afterlife, why are you rejecting the resurrection? Outside of the fact that you really don't like it, or you don't like the lifestyle that goes with it. So Kevin, I mean, as you know, in PhD studies, here's two areas now that we think atheists don't have a ground for, but many of them admit. One of them is an afterlife, and one of them is an ethical realm, an objective ethical realm. There's certain right and wrong. The example people use is you don't torture babies for fun. And if you do, we call that evil. We don't call that good. So ethics and an afterlife are two of the major views of somebody who is quote unquote religious. And resurrection fits very nicely with those.
Very good. I want to shift, and we've kind of naturally been moving this direction, but I want to shift gears just a touch. You also teach a seminar on religious doubt, and I know from your sharing your testimony that that's doubt is something that you are passionate to lecture on because you yourself went through a period of doubt in your life. Could you walk us through a little bit about how your experience with doubt and how the resurrection and your studies kind of helped you through that? Because in our culture today, there's just doubt is rampant, and it should be something that the church kind of welcomes and is okay to wrestle with and to help people walk through. And so could you share us just a little bit about your experience and then how your work on the resurrection helped you with that?
Yeah, no, we said a little while ago that oftentimes a person's worldview trumps the facts. And they allow data according to what they believe about that data. If there are, we've all seen extraordinary events, just normal events in the world that we doubt they could really happen. And then we see the circumstances under which they happen, and a police report or, things that people can measure, a medical report, and we say, wow, this world's a crazy place. And we know things that we initially disbelieve and doubt can be true. But here's the thing about doubt. I worked years ago with a clinical psychologist, and he sent a battery of tests to hundreds of people. And then we went through a doubt survey with them. And the majority of doubters, easily a majority, I'd say maybe 70 to 80%, are emotional doubters. If you give them facts from the resurrection, and they call themselves Christians, and you give them facts, they go out of your office happy. They go, wow, that's great. I got this bedrock to believe in. But if it was on a Monday, they'd be feeling on top of the world Monday night. Tuesday, they're pretty much on top of the world. Wednesday, yeah, sort of up on top of the world. Thursday, less on top of the world. Friday, the doubts are coming back. And by next Monday, they're ready to go to the counselor again. Because what happens is when you give a person who has emotional doubts the facts, it doesn't stick with them very long, because they're what ifing. There's two signs of emotional doubt, at least. And these two signs are very important. If a person comes to talk to me, I'll say, does your doubt hurt? And they will frequently say, hurt? It's the most painful thing in my life. Because really what I'm picturing is you're telling me that what I most want, peace in my Christian belief, what I most want, I will never have. That's what is the result of doubts, or can be. And if you're telling me I can never achieve it, I don't want the new car, the new house, the new job, a lot of money. I just want peace with my Lord. And so if it hurts, that's a sign that it's emotional. And secondly, emotional doubts are often, I don't want to say backed up, they're not really backing them up, but emotional doubts are occasioned by what if questions like this. here's 10 evidences for the resurrection. Well, what if we're wrong? Now, when someone says, what if we're wrong, just to show them what they're doing, I have a tendency to say, well, what if we're right? No, I'm serious. What if we're wrong? No, I'm serious. What if we're right? You're saying, what if we're wrong is no more weighty than my saying, what if we're right? And they go, well, okay, I get what you mean. It's just too good to be true. And not just saying it another way. But with those cases, you don't pile on the evidences. You help them work with the nature of their emotions. C.S. Lewis has a phrase. He says, when you doubt, you have to learn to tell your doubts where to get off. You have to tell your emotions. You have to, let's say, make your emotions stop. And there are ways to learn to do that that are very effective, but it's not piling on historical facts. It's dealing with what we would call counseling or those kind of reasons to come up with things to keep us from, and I started to say, keep us from thinking that way. You're not really thinking that way, you're feeling that way. And everybody knows feelings don't get you there, but that doesn't stop the pain if something's wrong. So you've got to help them to rewire their emotions so that those things don't bother them. And believe it or not, those methods can really, really, really work. By the way, let me recommend a book to you. It's not about doubts, but it's by two PhD psychologists, and they tell you how to deal with your emotions. There's many books that do this, but this book is called Telling Yourself the Truth, and it's a male author, William Backus, a female author, Marie Chapian, Chapiam, published by Bethany. And they take you through a 3-step program that's really quite easy. And I say program, you can learn to do it in 15 minutes. But you apply that every time you ask a what if question or every time you begin hurting. And you have to kind of, hate to say it this way, but you have to kind of beat down your emotions on this thing. Sometimes you don't want to beat down certain emotions. You love your grandkids or your children. You're not going to beat down those emotions, but you want to beat down emotions that are not in accord with the facts.
Very good. Thanks for that resource. So obviously the resurrection of Jesus is the pillar of, one of the pillars of the Christian faith. And Paul even says, if the resurrection hasn't happened, we are to be, most pitied. And so we do place a lot of hope in the resurrection because we put that hope in our future resurrection. And you've actually written a book on that called The Risen Jesus and Future Hope. Share with us just briefly, how do we apply the truth of the resurrection as a historical event to the spiritual side of things, where we say we can have hope in the face of pain, suffering and death? We can have hope in Jesus's resurrection that we too will be resurrected one day.
Well, the New Testament relates the resurrection of Jesus to virtually every area of theology, at least every major area of theology. And it relates the resurrection to many, if not most, areas of practice. So the resurrection is tied in with these doctrines. The one that is tied in with the most frequently, is the believer's resurrection. And almost 20 times in the New Testament, we are told that that believers will be raised because Jesus was raised. So there's the hope. Jesus himself said it. He said, because I live, you shall live also. He said, those who are dying, there's no death, you're passed from death onto life. I mean, there's death, but you know what I mean, not your spirits. And there's data for that. So if we have evidence, which we do for the resurrection, we have evidence for an afterlife, which we do, just like we have evidence for ethics, the 3 areas I mentioned. we have to reinforce those areas so that our hearts we don't go off emotionally when someone says Jesus was raised from the dead. We believe it, but we don't allow ourselves to start what ifing. You learn methods that control your emotions, and those methods kind of tamp down the emotion so that you can live and work like a pleased, fulfilled believer. It takes work, and we have to work all our lives. New Testament's full of comments about dealing with our emotions. Philippians 4 is a great text. Philippians 4, 6-9 gives us 4 different things we can do to work on our anxiety. And the Greek word there in the text shows that the Philippians were actually going through anxiety at that time. And the text says, here's how you deal with it. So the more we apply it, the more victory we get. We already have the teaching, we already have the facts, and now we have to make it work in our lives.
Very good. Thank you for that. I think we have time to get to 2 questions. This is a good one that came in from the MA team. They said Luke 24:36-53, talks about Jesus meeting with the disciples and eating fish and having a meal. You mentioned Paul's Paul's letters, the 7 of them that scholars agree. What about the Gospels as a historical source, historical documents? Do you use those in your presentations? And if not, why, or how should we apply those in conversations that we have with others?
Yeah, 2 good questions. I generally at least start with Paul because the data mostly come from Paul's epistles, and the critics love Paul. They think he's a good scholar. He was a Pharisee. He knows how to ask questions. He knows how to do research. He traveled to Jerusalem to interview Peter and James, the brother of Jesus. He stayed with him for 15 days. This is narrated in Galatians chapter 1. He went back 14 years later to Jerusalem and spent time with Peter and James again. And this time John is there. So you got the 4 most influential Christians of all time, Paul and Peter, James, the brother of Jesus, and John. They're all there. And the topic they're discussing is the gospel. And they give Paul and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship. I guess they laid hands on them. And they said, you take this message to the Gentiles and we'll take it to the Jews. And then in 1 Corinthians 15:11, Paul says, whether you ask them or whether you ask me, we're all going to tell you that we're going to tell you the same story. I'll answer your question, but so will Peter and so will James. And we've all seen the risen Jesus. And so you've got a lot of testimony here. And as you said earlier, Kevin, you quoted those verses that if Christ has not been raised, our faith is vain. Twice it says, different Greek word, but similar meaning. Our faith is vain. No sins have been forgiven, Paul says, if Christ hasn't been raised. So we have a foundation for these things and good reason for accepting them. Now, to the Gospels, your second question there. Yeah, I do use the Gospels. I use them quite a bit. Now, on the Gospels, the critics won't let you use all of just one book. But you have some choices. You can push back. You can say, you may not use the book of Mark, but I'm going to. It's the earliest gospel, we think. There's some reasons to believe it's true, a lot of good reasons. In a recent survey that a former student of mine teaching in the university, a student of his did a master's degree by interviewing over 200 New Testament scholars and asked them who wrote the book of Mark. And these are from the far right to the far left. They have to be scholars that he interviewed, but over 50% of them said Mark was the author, and just over 50% said his main source was Peter. Well, those are important facts. What we do with the Gospels is we use verses that have evidence to back them up. That's hard to explain, but there's a lot of verses like that, and they will they'll let you do it. Anything you can produce data for goes on the table. So, yep, I do use the Gospels. I use them quite widely. But straight for the resurrection, Paul is the strongest. And by the way, I made a comment earlier, haven't explained it yet. Critics believe you can trace the earliest resurrection testimony back to the 30s AD. Now think about that. If Jesus died in 30 AD and the earliest gospel doesn't appear for like 40 years, 40 years isn't condemning. I mean, remember years ago hearing about a veteran of World War II in the 1940s who wrote his memoirs of World War II in the 1990s. 40 years later, interestingly enough, he wrote his memoirs of World War II, and nobody would say you're lying. And he's giving his references. Well, that's what Mark's doing. It's just 40 years. But the resurrection teachings can demonstrably go back to 30s AD. And you say, they admit that? They actually do. Quite a few critical scholars will tell you not only that the resurrection message goes back to the 30s, but that it goes back to the early 30s. One of them, well, more than one, says it goes back to 30. And others will say it'll go back to a year later, approximately. So, I mean, we've got more evidence than we need to do this. It's more like changing hearts that we need. And until changing hearts happens, we're putting stones in shoes.
And speaking of evidence, we've now talked about Paul in the Gospels. Is there any historical data outside of the Bible that we can use from sources who aren't necessarily favorable to Christianity? Are there any in existence that we could use to say, yeah, see, they also believe something happened?
Yes, definitely. I've got a book called Historical Jesus, and I give about 12.5 sources. Now, the bad thing about these non-Christian sources, that they usually only contribute a sentence, or if you've got a paragraph, it's wonderful. But when you put them together, you get over 50 different aspects of the life, death, believed appearances of Jesus and the earliest church. You get those from non-Christian sources. Actually, they don't, this will be strange, sound strange to you. Most non-Christian scholars know they're there. They especially like Josephus, the Jewish historian, and Tacitus, the Roman historian. They're by far the most popular, but they almost never cite them to show something's true. And you say, well, if you like them, why not? And this is interesting, but they don't, because they think Paul beats Josephus and Tacitus every single time. And I think they would think that some of the gospel data it's better than Josephus and Tacitus every single time. So it's there. If anybody says, if Jesus is so great, how come they didn't know who he was? Well, they do. And there's a lot of writers. You can write a book on what we know about Jesus and never open up the New Testament.
And lastly, as I know we're running short on time, I thought this was a good question for us to ponder as well, looking forward. What do you think, just kind of backing up for a second, what do you think is the status of apologetics in the church today? Is it still, as alive and ever as ever? Is it still desperately needed? What has been your experience, especially during the pandemic time? And I know a lot of these apologetic formats went online and virtual, but what has been your experience, and what would you say is the status of apologetics in church?
Well, in the 1980s, if you sent in a manuscript to be published by a major evangelical company, I know they told me, I assume they're telling other people, we don't really need books in apologetics. We should just believe. And for those who want something, we've already got enough stuff out there. So apologetic works aren't going to sell. Then all of a sudden, in the last 20, 25 years of last century, and then this year, you've had movements come in like the New Age movement. The occult is always with us, and it seems to be stronger right now. You've got new movements like postmodernism, deconstruction. I heard a panel discussion the other day at the conference I was at. There were 3 people from major Christian performance groups, Christian rock groups that make the rounds, very well-known groups. And these 3 people and many of their friends had left the faith. And they explained why for an hour so many musical people were leaving. And by the way, it generally starts with emotions, and not because they think a fact is not true. They just doubt the power. So yeah, you're right. So all of a sudden now the publishers change, and I'm told by different publishers that apologetics are the hottest work selling today. Nobody worries about it till it comes into your home. It affects your teenage son or daughter, and now you're worried. They're hanging around with people. They're saying things that are scary. And now you're looking for answers. So apologetics is hot right now. It's not a be all end all. I mean, it's at least as powerful to work on people's emotions as well, as we've already said. But it's very, very popular today. Apologetics works are being published left and right regularly. In fact, Kevin, you probably know many of our PhD students who, when they publish their dissertations, when they write their dissertations, they've already gotten the books published. They're out there from various publishers. And my current teaching, my research assistant already has about 20 publications. We have another one who has, last time I heard, 4 or 5 books already. So there's a real need for it, and they want to help people. And so you do the right thing, right place, right topic, good reasons, and you get published.
Very good. Well, yeah, we are coming up on our time. So I just, on behalf of ICM, the board, any of the other folks that have joined us today, just want to say collectively, thank you for joining us in this most important of weeks on the religious calendar. Thank you for sharing with us about your time and experience on the resurrection. I think you said you have a couple other engagements today, so I know you're busy. But just really want to say thank you for this. This is encouraging, gives us a lot to think about. So I want to close this out in a time of prayer for you, Dr. Habermas. So I will go ahead and close us if you'll join me. So Father, we thank you for this day. We thank you for this time. We thank you for what it means to us. We thank you for the significance of the resurrection. We thank you that we have evidence. We have good reasons to believe that it happened. We're not just asked to believe blindly. We thank you for the life of Dr. Habermas and all the work that he has done and the way that you have worked through him to impact a generation of believers. And we just ask that you give him strength and endurance as he continues to work on his publishing his life's work, so that the church can have that for centuries to come. And lastly, we just thank you, Father, for allowing us to be a part of doing the work of the kingdom. Ask for blessings on the rest of this day, blessings on the end of our week as we head into time of worship on Sunday. We say and ask all these things in Jesus' name. Amen. All right.
Thanks very much, folks. Enjoyed it.
Thank you. Thank you. Be blessed, everyone.